In the last lesson, we looked at the prophets, and we talked a little about how throughout the history of the Israelites, the prophets would speak of a coming Messiah that would save them from all the conflicts that they were enduring. And that brings us to lesson 4, the life of Jesus. So this brings us to the New Testament. So the New Testament begins with the books called the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These are not in chronological order, um, meaning that that's not an order of how they happened. They're just 4 separate stories, and they are stories about Jesus's life. There are other books in the New Testament as well. This is just the first 4 books of the New Testament. Okay, so who was Jesus? So Jesus was raised by Mary and Joseph, who was a worker. Oftentimes he's described as a carpenter, although that's just kind of he wasn't necessarily a carpenter. Just the word means a worker, as he's described. And as a young adult, he became a traveling teacher. He traveled around kind of, where he was raised, kind of in the Mediterranean. And in the Bible, it has stories of him performing miracles, doing things like curing the sick, creating food, walking on water. This picture here is a picture of one of these miracles mentioned, creating food. And when it's he and his disciples have a few baskets of bread and fishes, and there's a whole bunch of people that have come to listen to him, and the disciples are like, "Hey, Jesus, it's lunchtime." And he's like, "Oh, just take all these fish around and take everything and feed everyone." And it's the loaves and fishes miracle, where he goes around and is, according to the story, multiplying the fish and the bread so that it can feed all of the people there. I mentioned disciples here, and his closest followers were called disciples. Disciples is not exclusive to Jesus. Disciple was a Jewish thing. So in the Jewish, throughout history, you'd have Jewish teachers, and the Jewish teachers would have disciples. It's like another word for students. The parables. So here is an example of a picture of Jesus telling like a parable. And there's a video. If you actually open this up yourself, you can watch this. But a parable is a story with a moral. And so lots of the stories that Jesus tells throughout the New Testament, or throughout the Gospels, really those 4 first books, are described as being parables. So he's telling a story, and the story has a moral. And he often preached these morals that he preached about were often things like justice and compassion and caring for like the lesser. We're gonna work on this in class together, and here is the Beatitudes and the Golden Rule. So the Beatitudes were a series of sermons and speeches, and they were kind of like descriptions of blessings for doing things. So here's an example of a beatitude: "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." And he also had the golden rule, as it's described, is, he often just encouraged people to live simply and humbly. And we have this golden rule a lot of times. You may have heard of the golden rule. I mean, that comes a lot from, you can see that in the Bible: "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you," which, if you've heard the golden rule, you probably haven't heard it like this. This is said kind of like it would be in one of the versions of the Bible in like older English, but you've probably just heard the golden rule being described as, be nice to other people because, you want people to be nice to you, that type of thing. So at one point in time throughout Jesus's life, after he's been traveling around, for a while. Normally, in the Bible, it describes his birth, and it doesn't go much into his childhood, and then it kind of jumps to his basically 30s ish, late 20s, 30s, and describes his the stories of him going around, and it kind of leads him up to going to Jerusalem. So as Jesus was traveling around, we're getting this part. As Jesus was traveling around, he angered a lot of people who heard him preach as he would travel around. And a lot of this is because Jesus came from a Jewish background, and a lot of the people at the time, these Jews in particular, had religious laws. The religious laws were things like you couldn't work on the Sabbath day, which was Sunday, or Saturday for the Jews, for some people. And so he would do things that really didn't jive real well with these religious laws. Sometimes in the Bible it's described as religious zealots. They were people who kind of they didn't really think of the spirit of the law, like what the law meant necessarily, so much as what the laws said. So, if the law said that you couldn't work on the Sabbath on Sunday, that meant that you literally couldn't do anything. You couldn't you couldn't if your horse or your cattle got injured, you couldn't help them because that's work. And so an example of Jesus breaking this rule is that he there's a story in the Bible that he heals someone on the Sabbath. And so a lot of religious leaders didn't like that, of the Jewish religious leaders didn't like that, because they perceived him healing someone as doing work. So he was breaking a lot of these laws, and then also a lot of Jewish leaders thought that only God could be doing these types of things. And so in a lot of ways, he was upsetting some of the religious leaders of the time. Another way that he was upsetting some of these religious leaders is that he was proclaiming that he was the Messiah and the Jewish liberator. And some people latched onto that message, but some other people didn't like that message as much because, as we discussed in the last thing, the Messiah was supposed to be the liberator of the Israelites. And for a lot of Jewish people at the time, they felt that the Messiah was literally going to be like a king or an emperor or a powerful military leader that would literally help take back power from the Romans at the time, who were in control. And so they didn't see him as being, a lot of people didn't see him as being the Messiah. So in addition to angering, the Jews and some religious people at the time, it also angered the Romans because he was claiming to be the Messiah and a Jewish liberator and ruler. It's like half of the people at the time thought that he wasn't the Messiah, but the people that did think that he was the Messiah was concerning to the Romans, because that meant that all these people thought that Jesus was going to overthrow the Romans and their authority, essentially. So a lot of Romans didn't like him. A lot of religious leaders didn't really like him. So that brings us to his death and resurrection. So one of his disciples, Judas, is described in the Bible. He's betrayed by Judas, and he gives Jesus up to the Romans, and the Romans arrest him and put on trial. This story is all in the where we're getting this information this is all in the Gospels, those 4 first books of the Bible. And so the Romans put him on trial and they sentence him, although technically they don't actually the Romans themselves don't actually sentence him. They actually essentially kind of pass the buck, because the Roman leader at the time didn't really want to do anything with him. And so he gives them to the Jews and basically says, you can do what you want with them if they want. And they decide to crucify him. And crucifixion means they nail him to a large cross. And so that's why Christianity, the cross is a symbol of Christianity, is because that's what Jesus was crucified on. And so they would basically lay the cross down, and they would nail. This is not just death for Jesus, but the Romans often crucified people. Usually they didn't nail people to them, they would just tie them. But they would nail people at times, and they would nail through their wrists and through their feet. And so people were literally nailed to the wood, and they would kind of slowly die. So not kind of slowly die, they would slowly die. And so according to the Gospels and the Bible, Jesus dies on a cross, and 3 days later he resurrects. He comes back to life, and this resurrection is the basis of modern Christianity. The idea that Jesus rose again, and his resurrection was proof to many of his followers as being divine. So in the Gospels, it's described that Jesus went around a while after his resurrection and kind of like met with people, met with his disciples, and before he ascended into heaven. And the reason that this is a big deal in terms of Christianity is because it kind of goes back to the Old Testament. And in the Old Testament, people would be always sacrificing animals. We kind of talked about that earlier on. They would give animal sacrifices. You were sacrificing things that were really important to you to show you how much you loved God and trusted him and things like that. And Jesus was supposed to be like the ultimate sacrifice. So he was supposed to, in a lot of Christianity, like the followers of Jesus after the first Christians, they weren't doing sacrifices anymore, because the idea was that Jesus was the sacrifice. He died for everyone, and then he rose again. So, and that will take us to our next lesson.